This image is a detail of the famous School of Athens painting by the Renaissance artist Raphael, completed in the year 1511. At the very center of this huge fresco, which means a painting that was done on a wall, there are two figures, Plato and Aristotle. This famous artwork was completed over 1500 years after Plato and Aristotle died, which tells you a little bit about how important Plato and Aristotle continued to be even during the Renaissance, so many years later. In the painting, Plato's on the left. He's the older one, the teacher, and he's pointing up at the heavens. Aristotle, the younger student, is on the right and has a hand gesturing down towards the earth. Why are they shown this way? Well, this is meant to symbolize something about who Plato and Aristotle were and what they believed. Plato was focused on the ideal form of everything. He believed that the world of forms was more real than this world. That's why he is pointing up towards the heavens. Aristotle, on the other hand, believed in practical knowledge, useful knowledge, in other words, and nature. That is why he is shown with a hand gesturing down towards the earth. Plato is what you would call an idealist in philosophy, but his greatest student, Aristotle, is what would be called a realist in philosophy. But what do these terms mean? It's actually pretty simple. Plato believed that knowledge came from pure reason, which is why we call him an idealist. He believed that the world of forms was more real than the physical world. That's why we would call him an idealist. Aristotle, meanwhile, believed that this world was the most important thing, and that the information that came through the five senses was most important. It was the best way of getting knowledge. That's what makes him a realist. Aristotle was born in Macedon, a kingdom just to the north of ancient Greece. When Aristotle was a young man, he came to Athens and he studied under Plato at the academy for 20 years. But after his teacher Plato died, he returned to Macedon, where he became the tutor to Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great left Greece to pursue his great conquest of Asia, Aristotle returned to Athens. He did not inherit the academy from Plato. He actually started his own school called the Lyceum. If Socrates is known for teaching through dialogue, Aristotle was actually known for teaching while walking. He would walk the grounds at Lyceum while teaching his students. He had a great love of nature and anything that would grow. He closely observed the way that living things would transform over the course of their lives. His student, Alexander the Great, even sent him plant and animal specimens from around Asia that Aristotle could use for his research. Aristotle even developed a system of biological classification that was used for over 1,000 years. This shows the nature of Aristotle's down-to-earth, grounded, practical wisdom. Aristotle's ideas are more grounded in the world of the senses than Plato's is. Aristotle's philosophy is more concerned with the physical world and how to actually live in it than it is with ideals and forms. This can even be seen in the way that Aristotle thought about human behavior. Aristotle observed that happy, successful people also possessed certain qualities called virtues. A virtue is a good quality that you should try to develop for your own self. Honesty, for example, is a virtue. So is determination. So because Aristotle observed that happy people possessed these virtues, the question was how to develop these virtues for our own selves. Aristotle noticed that every virtue was actually a middle point between two vices. A vice is like the opposite of a virtue. It's a bad habit that harms either us or others. So, for example, someone who lies is dishonest, and dishonesty is a vice. But somebody who is always telling the truth, even if it's harsh or cruel or unhelpful, is also not necessarily doing the right thing either. So, honesty, the virtue of honesty, is the middle point between those two vices of dishonesty on the one hand and excessive truthfulness on the other hand. Another example would be the virtue of generosity. Someone who never gives things to others, who lacks that charitableness, becomes stingy. They become a miser, and that's a vice. But on the other hand, someone who constantly gives might harm themselves or their families, and that's also a vice. So the virtue of generosity is somewhere between the vices of miserliness on the one hand and excessive generosity on the other hand. This balancing point of virtue between two vices is what Aristotle called the golden mean. The key was to find this balancing point between the two extremes. But here's maybe the most important thing to understand. For Aristotle, being a good person is not about having a good heart. It's about performing good deeds. That means that virtue is not necessarily inborn, it's a habit. The more you can practice virtue, the better you become. Aristotle, therefore, placed great importance upon the need of teachers, specifically teachers who actually possessed these virtues that their students could emulate or imitate. The world needed better teachers. And through the existence of better teachers, we would have more virtuous people. And if we had more virtuous people, people would be happier and more successful. Everyone would benefit. It would create a better world. And that's the key for Aristotle. Good philosophy leads to a better world. Aristotle also realized that teachers couldn't be effective unless they could actually persuade or convince people to listen to them. So Aristotle spent a lot of energy studying and talking about a branch of knowledge called rhetoric, which is the branch of knowledge that uses reason and emotion to try to persuade others and convince them of your point of view. That shows again the practical wisdom of Aristotle. It's not enough to be a good person. You also have to be a good person who can actually convince others to be good as well. Whether Aristotle was studying an animal, a plant, an embryo, a tree, a human life, or all of society, he was most concerned with what would make something function or work better. The value of philosophy for Aristotle was not in its ideals, but in its ability to concretely make the world a better place and make people more virtuous and happier. This happiness that comes from living virtuously is what Aristotle called eudaimonia. And whether Aristotle was studying poetry, politics, ethics, or biology, Aristotle was most concerned with trying to develop a practical wisdom that would allow people to live happier, more fulfilling, and successful lives filled with this eudaimonia. When Alexander the Great conquered much of Asia, he also spread Greek ideas to all the places that he conquered. And of course, the ideas of his teacher. When he conquered Egypt, for example, he founded the great city of Alexandria. And there in Alexandria, he founded the Great Library. Alexandria stood as a center of learning for centuries afterwards, as it stood at the crossroads of three different continents: Europe, Asia, and of course, Africa. As an aside, if you want to learn about one of Alexandria's great thinkers, who also just so happens to be a woman, look no further than Hypatia of Alexandria, one of the great scholars of the ancient world. She was a philosopher in the tradition of Plato, a mathematician and astronomer, and she's actually featured in Raphael's painting, The School of Athens. She's the only woman in the painting and the only figure in the painting who looks directly at you, confronting you, the observer. For her brilliance, Hypatia was tragically murdered by a mob in 415 AD. Her life stands as a testament to the power, the consequence of ideas, and the way that people can sometimes fear those ideas. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were some of the most remarkable thinkers in all of history. Together, they form the foundation upon which Western civilization was built. Aristotle's ideas, in particular, continued to be studied throughout Europe through the Middle Ages for over 1,000 years. He was considered the foundation of almost every branch of knowledge, in particular, scientific branches of knowledge. Although Aristotle was continually studied through the Middle Ages, most of the works of the other Greek thinkers were actually lost to Europe during this era of history. When the Europeans finally rediscovered the works of the ancient Greeks, like Plato in particular, during the 1400s, this helped birth an era of history we call the Renaissance. Renaissance is a word that literally means rebirth, and it specifically refers to the rediscovery in Europe of the ancient Greeks. That's why the painting The School of Athens by Raphael was completed in 1511, so long after Plato and Aristotle lived, because 1511 is at the height of the Renaissance, during the exact period in which Europeans were rediscovering the unbelievable genius of those ancient Greek thinkers. But what's perhaps even more remarkable is that the Renaissance actually marks the end of the Middle Ages. It ushered in what we call the modern era of history. In other words, it was very largely the rediscovery of the ancient Greeks that helped birth the modern world that you and I live in. That's how important these thinkers have been to the development of our civilization. It is impossible to think about how different our world would be if it weren't for the contributions of those great minds of ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in particular. Many of our ideas, whether we're talking about politics, government, religion, science, biology, poetry, they all come directly out of those thinkers. If we can think of Western civilization as a tree that has been growing for thousands of years, we can think of the contributions of the ancient Greeks and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in particular as the roots of that great tree. This concludes Lesson 4 of Big Ideas Throughout History.